Hello, everybody tuning in. Welcome to another Global Immersion webinar. We are thrilled to have you with us. And as you all are signing in, I'm going to walk through a couple notes to orient us before we jump into some of the content. First off, my name is John Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion. And this is our newest webinar series we're titling Ending This Uncivil War. And our hope is in this first part to offer some tangible perspectives from within a post-Civil War context in Lebanon and ask questions about the implications of this moment for us as everyday peacemakers within civic society in the United States. Next week, we're going to have part two, which will focus on leadership. How do we as leaders navigate this moment of uncivil war within our churches, our congregations, communities, families, and so on. So who are we? We're Global Immersion is a peacemaking training organization, and we train people of faith to engage our very divided and conflicted world in restorative ways. We trust that God's work is restoration, that God's mission is restoration, and that we are invited to participate in that as everyday peacemakers. So for us, how do we do that? We do it in two primary ways. One, historically, has been our primary way is through immersive learning, by taking the opportunity to go to the center of global conflicts and to learn from the peacemakers embedded within them, because we found those to be the best instructors for our practice as peacemakers at home. We've done that in the Middle East, in Palestine, Israel, and here at the border in Tijuana, San Diego. Obviously, in a COVID world, those are in freeze at the moment. We also do that through formational programming, workshops, retreats, coaching, consulting, online resources like these webinars. Our hope, like the ingredients we see of an everyday peacemaker, comes by cultivating our soul, building our theology that informs our practice, our life, and our leadership. And so those components of soul, theology, and practice inform all of our trainings. One tangible way you can jump in that's free and it's regular, we have a contemplative gathering 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that we host the 10 to the soul of the everyday peacemaker. There's a link in your chat if you want to jump in on that. It's free, and it's about 20 or 30 minutes. This webinar series, as I mentioned, the bigger arc of this, today's conversation, we want to explore the role we as peacemakers can play in de-escalating the polarization of this specific moment in our country, our churches, our families. Even leading up to the election and now post-election, we've heard all sorts of talk about the potential for a civil war reality here in the United States. And we've seen seeds of hatred manifest themselves in incredibly visceral ways, even in the last few weeks. So if there's anything we've learned, it's that an election doesn't put an end to the dehumanization, to the misunderstanding, and our growing fear of our political other, or our theological other, or ideological other. And so we want to dig into that conversation today. And I want to say a special thank you for all of you that are part of our Embers community, which is our community of monthly donors who support this work. Our webinars, this webinar, and the resources that'll follow up are powered by you, allow us to do this for free. So thank you. And if you want to consider joining that community, there's a link in the chat. Couple tech notes. If you can jump in the chat thread right now and toss in your name and say where you're coming from and why you're spending this time on this webinar. Why'd you say yes? Why'd you register for this? That would be wonderful, so we can begin to orient to who's in this conversation with us. We want it to be as interactive as possible. Another way to interact is if you have bigger questions, especially as you're listening to our panelists, drop them in the Q&A function. We'll be moderating those as they come in. There'll be a moment later in the conversation where we can open up to those conversations, so to those questions. So please drop those in as you're listening, starting now all the way through the middle of the webinar. Let me introduce you briefly into who we get to listen and learn from today, and I am really fired up about this. I recently started a PhD program focusing in Christian ethics and specifically in political ethics, and I've already been able to interact with colleagues and advisors and professors that are informing this today. So I'm deeply grateful to be spending more time with both of these friends in the coming many years as I pursue this program. The first is Chaden Hani. She's a pastor and a peacemaker in Beirut, Lebanon. I would describe her as a practitioner in a post-Civil War peace-building efforts. And so I'm really thrilled to hear more from her. Specifically, she's focused on creating spaces of understanding narratives of those on the other side of a conflict. How do we understand those on the other side of a conflict so we can move towards true reconciliation? Dr. David Gushee is a pastor as well. He's a professor in Atlanta, Georgia. He's a leading Christian ethicist who's been a personal guide of mine and a friend for many years. In fact, we were just talking before we went live that we first met in Palestine, Israel on a delegation led by the late Glenn Stassen, who was deeply influential in our peacemaking work. We met 10 years ago on that trip, and he's actually been central to my discernment too, moving towards this PhD program I'm in now. He has a book that just came out recently called After Evangelicalism, A Path to a New Christianity, that I would consider a must read, deeply, especially for many of you who are listening in here, have grown up in the evangelical context and have grown uncomfortable with the way our evangelicalism is informing the way we're showing up in the world and looking for a theology and a faith beyond that that's rooted in Jesus. Read this book and allow it to shape and inform you. David is a social ethicist. He's going to help us understand how do we as Christians engage civic society in constructive ways. So with all that being said, let me first introduce you to Chaden and hand it to you to give a bit of a personal introduction so we can better understand who you are and why you're showing up in this call before we go forward. Take it away.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you, Global Immersion, for this opportunity to really share the story from this part of the world. I am a Lebanese woman from a Druze background. Druze are an offshoot of Shiite Islam. I'm married with 3 children. My husband and myself, we co-pastor a church in the Druze community comprised of Druze background believers. I have an MA in computer science and a bachelor in theology, also a master's degree in religions from the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies from the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary. Currently, as you said, in my doctoral journey in reconciliation and peace through multiple narratives. I have lived through the civil war in Lebanon from 1975 till 1990 and have been involved in peacemaking initiatives, like you said, since 5 years. Because me and my colleagues believe that faith values can be used intentionally in order to advance the common good of society across conflicted lines. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chaden.
Thank
David,
you, John.
You bet. Take it away.
Well, thanks, John. It's good to be doing one of these conversations with you, and it's an honor to learn from Chaden about the Lebanese context. I've always wanted to understand that context better, so I'm pleased. I'm from the Northern Virginia area. I'm kind of a government brat in the sense that my dad worked for the government, the federal government in the U.S. I was always taught to care very deeply about the well-being of our society and the functioning of our government. But then kind of a conversion experience when I was 16 years old took me into the Southern Baptist and evangelical world. And so I would say my educational and ministry pilgrimage has been about stitching together the childhood emphasis on American society and the best for our country, and the teenage experience of knowing and loving Jesus and wanting to be a faithful disciple. And Christian ethics, Christian social ethics is kind of how I put that together. And so I've been a self-identified, let's say I was a self-identified evangelical ethicist for about 25 years until I concluded within the last 5 years that identity doesn't work for me anymore, and I have some serious problems with it. And so I speak now kind of from the lessons learned in what has gone wrong with white evangelical Christianity in the U.S. in particular. So on the one hand, I'm reflecting a lot on evangelicalism, and on the other hand, I'm still doing social ethics, and I think that brings me into this space today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thrilled to have you both here. It is an honor and a gift. So, and really fun to read in the chat thread there, all the folks that are jumping in from quite literally around the world. So thank you for doing that. Even as you're watching people jump in, notice those that may be part of your tradition, part of your geographical context, so you can continue to stay connected beyond this. It looks like there's a very similar set of questions that are bringing many of you to this conversation. Let me offer a few words of introduction to frame this, and then we'll move into longer sessions with both Chaden and David. So how do we end a civil war before it starts? And some would say maybe it's already actually begun in many ways. For us, organizationally and as peacemakers, our theological starting point, again, is understanding that God's mission is restoration. God is working to restore all that's broken, both personally and systemic. We trust that all things are being made new. This isn't just about a personal evacuation, salvation plan. This is about actually participating in the systems and structures to see that those systems actually directly impact each one of us. They impact real people in real neighborhoods like each one of us. They often impact those on the underside of power in more painful and visceral ways than many of us, like myself, in dominant culture spaces. So peacemakers have to pursue peace both in personal and in systemic ways, which is why this conversation matters. What does peace mean in this context? We want to be really clear up front that peace that we're proposing is not a return to the status quo. We don't want to not deal with the underlying issues that are being manifest today. In particular, this partisan dehumanization, white supremacy, Christian nationalism. These have deep roots, and walking away in this moment to go back to the way things used to be is actually a return to death, to unrestoration, it's antithetical to what we would see as God's mission of healing that is broken. Jesus was obviously someone who's unafraid of disrupting the status quo of systems and structures, but he didn't do it through capital riots. He did it with selfless sacrifice, ultimately leading to a cross that leads to resurrection. So peace for us, as we understand it, is a proactive movement through conflict. We have to go towards the conflict that's actually manifesting itself in all of these uncivil ways. What does peace that moves towards conflict look like? It's seeking to understand those that we don't understand before just trying to get our agenda across. It's exploring the core fears and maybe the trauma that's driving us towards hatred and dehumanization. We would argue that dehumanization actually extinguishes the image of God in both the dehumanized and the one who is dehumanizing. And language matters. If there's anything we know about recent years, language matters because it shapes how we view our reality and how we interact with our other. I also want to note, many of you probably are sitting here understanding the relational impact this moment is having on you. Many are losing faith in people we love because we're falling victim to this uncivil war, especially those who are participating in some kind of distorted view of Christianity. In the last week, I've heard from friends who, one, had a friend who he's been close with for many, many years in his church, who he later found out was actually at the Capitol riot, and he's now disoriented to say, how is someone that close to me holding an ideology that would lead to that? Another friend who was describing his inability to talk to his dad anymore, both of them Christians, but his father's ideology has become so extreme that it's interrupting their relationship and their ability to just have a discussion and disagree with one another. So what are the tools we need to end this uncivil war of words and actions before it turns into an actual civil war of violence? Today's conversation hopefully will give you some perspective and some tools to engage personally and systemically. Some of the questions we're going to ask and hear Chaden and David interact with: what can we learn from another context that has suffered through a civil war to stop ours before it starts? What are the tools for understanding our political other? What are ways we can and need to engage in civic society in proactive and courageous ways that move us beyond this status quo, while also not perpetuating this uncivil war? What does a Christian witness and practice look like in this moment? The last thing I want to say is we actually are not here to agree with each other on everything. That's actually not very interesting to us. We don't even know if that's a dynamic learning environment. We are here to learn, to grow our capacity for critical thinking that informs our daily action. So as you're listening to things, don't expect to agree with everything you hear. In fact, if you don't, use that as an opportunity for formation. What is it that causes you to be upset about that disagreement? What is it that you can learn and grow from? What are the questions you can ask and allow the Spirit to guide you towards constructive engagement that rather than just a reaction to what you're hearing? We actually think this is central to being a peacemaker in and of itself. Okay, so with all that being said, that's the most I'm going to say today. I'm going to hand it over to Chaden. And I want to start, I know you're going to give us some context for where you are in Lebanon, and especially a post-Civil War Lebanon. The question I want to start with that will seed how you're starting here is, what are the social ingredients that led to the civil war in Lebanon? So I'll ask that question now, and you can circle back to where this thing started.
Yes, thank you, John. I need to give you a brief overview of what led, how Lebanon is formed. So Lebanon is a small country, but it comprises 18 officially recognized Christian, Muslim, and Islamic-derived sects. The communities, they operate under their religious laws for personal status and have their own courts for the same reason. They also have structured the current Lebanese political system known as the confessional democracy. The idea of these sectarian communities as political platform for its members began with the Christian sect known as Maronite and the Druze by the mid-19th century. Such representation emerged as the foundation of the participatory governing system in modern Lebanon after 1920. On one hand, communal shares guaranteed representation of different groups in decision-making, even if their elites made the decision. We have they are called Za'ama, Za'im. And on the other hand, these communal shares reinforced sectarian identity at the expense of commitment to the country. But the control of segments of this bureaucracy by communal bosses invited the distribution of jobs and contracts as favors to clients based on religious affiliation. Given these family and social obligations, patronage disfigured the system and enforced political sectarianism. Lebanese communities began as cultural expressions, but ended as being politicized. Unfortunately, sectarianism was used or abused by these political elite to serve their personal gains. They used religion to further break the social fabric that existed between the Lebanese. Other elements as well reinforced this divide, like the external allies each religious community was affiliated to, and the absence of common identity for the country also was a significant factor separating these communities. Pre-assumptions caused fear from one another, and as you said, dehumanizing the other. The absence of values, of common values that we learn from our religious heritage were absent. Dialogue also, which is an important issue, we have to dialogue with one another, was absent. And the shared vision for the country, all of these ultimately erupted the civil war in 1975. And for 15 years of fighting, around 90,000 people lost their lives, and the majority internally were displaced, and some are still missing until now. We experienced chaos, violence, massacres dominated the scene between 75 and 90. The civil war created really a tragic history that remains imprinted in the memory of the Lebanese people until today. And we are living the consequences of it until today. So that was a brief of the structure of the Lebanese context. So I presume there is a similarity between, not a similarity between Lebanon and the States. And there are many lessons really to learn and to prevent what happened in Lebanon. So I hope this brief would give you an image, a clear image of the situation that we lived through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's where I want to jump in and ask. You mentioned some of the ingredients that led to this turning into a civil war, and then we hear about the implications of violence, obviously, and even to today, there's still all of these folks that are missing as a result of this. If you were to distill, to pull out some main reasons that society began to allow this thing to escalate, like you talked about dehumanization. What were the ways people were talking to each other that moved them further and further and further apart, such that the only way they saw a way forward was to begin to kill each other? Fear.
We feared one another. Everybody, a lack of communication, and sectarianism also, and following the leaders without questioning them, without asking the why, and forgetting the values. We have values. Every religion has values, but we did not communicate, we did not get together, we did not dialogue with one another to understand. So if I don't know you, I don't know your intentions, we don't agree on the same idea of the same vision for this country, that we want to live, to coexist together in one country, this break between societies, reinforced by the politicians and each following his ideology, created this break in the fabric, in the social fabric, and each community started to follow their leaders, and that's how the communities broke apart. And when the leaders wanted that for their own interests, they will always use the religious belief, the ideologies, to fire their communities.
Mhm.
I don't know if I explained.
No, very, very, really well. I mean, I'm hearing like the sectarian reality, probably leaders that were leveraging their religious authority to propose
Yes.
a worldview that said this is the only way we can think about things, and anyone outside of that all of a sudden is our enemy, which I think is
Yes.
like when the way language and religion can begin to work as a divide. Were there
Yes.
efforts made for reconciliation in the midst of all this, and why did they fail? Like, why did this thing continue to escalate?
Yes, definitely. Post-war dialogue efforts captured the attention of many religious clergies. They started immediately after the ceasefire in 1990. The National Christian Muslim Committee for Dialogue was formed to address these sectarian issues among the major religious groups in the country. Some of the country's academic institutions as well were active in peace building initiatives, as well as the UNESCO, which established the Chair for Comparative Religious Studies in 2002. Personally, I was involved in a peace building initiative called the Friendship Network between church and mosque goers, which was inspired by common Christian and Muslim faith values, who seeks to respond to this uneasy context Lebanon has reached. And if you allow me, I would like to speak a little bit about this friendship network. It's a faith-based peace building initiative that was launched by the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies in 2017. The uniqueness of this friendship network lies in the fact that it is led by a steering team consisting of 3 Christian and 3 Muslim faith leaders responsible to direct and advise the progress of this initiative, and to encourage and promote grassroots interaction that fosters these friendship relationships based on the 3 main components of friendship, which are empathy, trust, and respect. These values are rooted in religious beliefs developed by both Christians and Muslims at the same time. Now you ask me, they failed. I think corruption, I think politicizing, sectarianism played a major role in slowing the process. It did not, I can't confess that they failed totally. Mm-hmm. But looking back now, finally at the 2020, which brought other devastating events to the Lebanese scenery that cannot be overlooked by me. The regional play of powers, with their extended arms in the internal political scene headed by the warlords, brought Lebanon to an economic breakdown that caused a popular outburst on the 17th of October 2019. I don't know if you have heard of it, and subsequently launched a devastating scenario that was witnessed worldwide, a street protest movement fueled by the rapidly deteriorating socioeconomic and political conditions. Then we have the public health emergency brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the horrific Beirut blast disaster, I call it, on the 4th of August. All these events definitely have put a stop to our initiatives. Yeah. So I don't want to believe we failed. I just want to say the process is slowed down. Yeah. But hopefully we will continue, and we are still thinking and dreaming to bring about peace in this devastating context that we live in.
Thank you, Chaden. And we'll come back to some of those tangible ways that you're working towards peace, building ways for us to hear from and understand our other. I want to go to David here, who again is a social ethicist, is thinking about how our Christian witness intersects with civic society here today. You've been outspoken in your analysis of how Christians have done well and done really poorly in engaging civic society. What would be your analysis of what's led to this uncivil war that we find ourselves in here in the U.S.?
I still think we're figuring it out because a new level has been reached with the January 6th siege of the Capitol and some of the people there being Christians. I think some things were unveiled that were not as clear before. But if I were to try to trace it back, there's many ways to look at it. At one level, some of the issues that caused our actual civil war 150 years ago were never resolved. Whether our society was going to be a society dominated by white Christian men or was going to be a multiracial, inclusive democracy. Some of us felt like that issue had been resolved, but it's clear that not everybody is happy with the resolution of a multiracial, multi-confessional democracy that includes everybody. So our racial divisions, our power divisions, the fact that America has become, over the last 60 years especially, an immigrant society with much more religious and ethnic and national diversity. Some of us thought that was a great and positive development. Others have been threatened by it. Economic divisions, now increasingly tied to worldview divisions, where it seems that the elites now often lean liberal and lean multicultural and lean towards this multiracial democracy vision, also seem to be succeeding economically. And those who are not as much succeeding economically are frustrated and are looking for people to blame. The divisions of the 1960s, I think, were kind of a foreshadowing of where we are now, with the marching in the street and the political assassinations and the left-right divisions. This feels somehow more ominous. We used to think that was as bad as it was going to get, but this feels more ominous. I also think that while the Republican Party has had populist voices that have kind of whipped up these worries, now for the last 4 years, a president has been in power using Twitter and inspiring other social media radicalization. And so previously, people like Barry Goldwater or Pat Buchanan or even Ross Perot, or voices before that of populist rage at the establishment, never had a champion like this. This one became president and figured out how to whip up the crowd, and his own mix of personal resentments, despite his success, really connected to the resentments of others. And he also learned how to play the nationalist card, and the Christian nationalist card, despite, I think, pretty dubious religiosity on his part. So I think Trumpism has been a metastasizing of trends that were there. And once you kind of unleash a radicalization in a society, it can really accelerate quickly. So in one sense, what we're talking about is the entire history of America. In another sense, we're talking about since the 60s. And then you might say we're talking about since the what has been developing with the Republican Party since the late 70s. But then a lot of it, I think, is down to Trumpism just since 2015, accelerating and pouring gasoline on very flammable material.
And that's I think a lot of us listening in here are like these historical threads they connect dots that I think maybe we have some dots there, but weren't sure where the connective tissue lands.
Yeah.
One of the things that's most perplexing in all this is I presume most people on this call identify as Christian, and we understand our vocation to be people who are participating in God's restoration, but we're watching Christian America, U.S. America, not only like be absent from participating in healing, but perpetuate divides. And help us understand why that might be. How have we so far abdicated our responsibility to be peacemakers that we're actually perpetuating what's broken?
You know, the historians who have been talking about developments, I mean, I'm more familiar with the discussion on the Protestant side, though the Catholics have their own version of this. Basically, we have lost unity in Jesus because we have splintered along left and right lines just like everyone else. And so you might say, to go to Chaden's comments, it's like our confessional divisions are not like Muslim versus Christian, but Christian versus Christian, liberal Christian versus conservative Christian. And now I think a split within conservative Christianity between kind of Trumpist Christian nationalism and some other strands that are there. Mm-hmm. You can, if you want to look on the Protestant side, I think you'd have to talk about the liberal fundamentalist divide from 100 years ago, which eventually gave birth to U.S. evangelicalism, which understood itself to be a unifying movement in the beginning. But then out of U.S. evangelicalism came the Christian right in the late 70s. And then the Christian right got married to the Republican Party, so that white evangelicals increasingly lost the ability to distinguish between Republican loyalty and Christian loyalty. Mm-hmm. And then most deadly, I think, is whoever the Republicans put forward, white evangelicals would support just because of that political loyalty. And when it became Donald Trump, the loyalty transferred to him despite all the problems. And then he became especially good at toxifying that loyalty and making it really socially destructive. Yeah. But I would have to say, on the left, there is left Christianity too. Mm-hmm. There's deep identification with the Democratic Party, identification of Democratic Party values with Christian values, understood, you know, from a left perspective, increasing incomprehension of the other side, even dehumanization and so on. I don't see the radicalization as being the same, but the sense of mutual incomprehension, yeah, calling one another heretics across these lines, even what issues are considered to be fundamental. On the right, it was abortion. On the left, it was race or poverty or the environment. One should not underestimate the role of abortion as, like, there are people who were there, I'm sure, on January 6th, out of the same argument, you know, as if a Democrat is in power, we're murdering babies at massive rates and that must be stopped, and now it's time. Violence has been used on that front for a while, right? Mm-hmm. So the Christian community lacks very many figures, thinkers, or movements that show any ability to transcend this left-right division. Mm-hmm. We have sunk into the left-right division ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's a really important piece that we want to reiterate. You know, we have to think with a level of nuance and self-reflection to say that it's not that the left or the right isn't it's not about picking a left or right. It's about having our eyes towards the values of the kingdom and having that inform the way we engage civic society. And we all have work to do. And that's not both sidesism saying one is better or worse than the other either, because we want to be very clear about the need to disrupt a status quo that isn't leading towards healing. But we have to do this, the interior work that identifies, oh yeah, I have just bounced from being an extreme right-wing Republican to I've put all my hope and allegiance into this left-wing agenda. And we have to have the ability to see through that. I want to get really tangible now with you too, if we can, in the rest of this webinar. And I know people are listening in like, hey, I have a family conflict right now, and I don't know how to talk with my sister about this. I don't know how to talk with my dad about this. My church, half my church voted for Trump, half my church voted for Biden, or some ratio. We work with those churches, and you're on this call. Chaden, what have you seen are tangible ways that we can grow in our ability to understand the narrative of our other before just dehumanizing them. Oh, they're that crazy right winger, they're that crazy left winger. How do we understand them? And what are some ways that you actually employ tangibly that practice?
Okay, I will yes, talk about the project that we are involved in, because it's called Bringing Truth and Reconciliation Through the Multiple Narrative Approach. So we thought this could heal or mend the divide that happened between the religious communities, because no party was held accountable and there was no true reconciliation after the Civil War. After the sudden cease of fire, because it was really very sudden, former warlords converted into a new political elite, and they turned the bureaucratic structure into cartels at the service of sectarianism rather than the national interests. Today, Lebanon continues to suffer from sectarian strife, endemic corruption, and inadequate governance. So the objective is to advance religious freedom, pluralism, and democratic participation, bringing new hope in a hopeless context as we have. This project that we want to launch, hopefully in a few months, uses a multiple narrative approach to revisit that period and encourage the emergence of diverse, even opposing accounts of the conflict that happened during the war. Doing so, we hope will highlight that each group has both suffered and done harm, has both took good and bad decisions. The purpose is to initiate a dialogue and to counter the dominant discourse that often pits one sect against the other, each feeling like a minority in a hostile environment, or each one feeling that he was right and the other was wrong. So we want to bring those narratives together without summarizing them, just for each party or each side to hear what the other went through and to acknowledge their hurt and their pain. Mm-hmm. So when you do that, actually, when you talk about your pain, you give the other the chance or the right to say his side of the story as well. So that was inspired by the philosophy. Yes.
Can I jump in right there?
Yes.
How do we actually create an environment that allows us to share our perspective with someone who has a different narrative? Like, what's the environment we have to create? Again, I'm thinking of our churches. If we say a church is disagreement, and I would apply that to these groups you're bringing together, what's the environment you need to create so that there's actually a sense of trust and you're not just the minority that's going to get, run over? How do we do that? How do we create those spaces?
If I may go back to the friendship network, I didn't mention it in vain. We targeted the religious actors or the pastors. Let's say, let's take, for example, 2 churches. So with the help of the pastors, they would bring a core group from their churches and to initiate a dialogue. To encourage a friendship relationship based on empathy, trust, and respect, and implement the dialogue conditions, like to hear one another, to hear your side of the story without interrupting you, to listen, and to share your heart without judging you. So we have developed some rules for encouraging a healthy dialogue between those, if you want to say, religious groups, to bring about, to allow the other to hear his side, why he thinks like that. And all of these are based on religious Christian value, on biblical values. If I made that clear.
So I'm hearing you say really tangibly.
So that's the model. Yes.
Identify a leader who has enough courage to use their influence to bring their community around the table with another community who may see things differently, and do it out of their core convictions, whether it's out of their tradition, Islam, or whether it's out of Christianity or they're Druze or they're Jewish. those values can still bring us to the table. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay. That's really helpful and practical. David, I'd love to hear you interact with similar. I mean, how are we tangibly engaging in practices of peacemaking or de-escalation that isn't perpetuating status quo, or actually undoing this escalating ideological divide?
I'm seeing all the comments related to divisions in families and churches.
Yes.
And here in Atlanta, I teach, and actually in Macon, I teach both seminary students and college students for whom Thanksgiving and Christmas were terrorizing events because of family divisions over all of this. I mean, this is real.
Mm-hmm.
When we went to Israel Palestine on our dual narrative tour, John,
Mm-hmm.
I never could have imagined that we would need to bring those techniques here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that what has developed is at least two narratives, two main narratives. We could call it the narrative of the religious right in its new Trumpist form and the narrative of the left. You might call it the narrative of Fox News and the narrative of MSNBC if one wants to
Mm-hmm.
put a media label on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what, Chaden was saying about you have to, in situations where the fabric is tearing because the narratives are so different, some people need to be able to broker dual narrative or multiple narrative conversations. And Christians ought to be able to do that. Unfortunately, American Christians, especially white evangelical American Christians, are kind of, well, a lot of us are sucked into one of the narratives, or we don't know kind of how to broker a conversation with people who are on one side.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need to learn from the skills of peacemakers in multiple contexts who have pioneered multiple narrative or dual narrative kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I think, involves literally conversations in which the ground rules are we all come together and you share your narrative, I share my narrative, and we do not interrupt each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then we attempt to diagnose where our narratives came to diverge.
Mm-hmm.
And is it about different readings of facts? Can we heal the breach related to facts? Where can we go to find shared sources of information that we can both trust? Is it related to values? Where did the values divergence happen? Can we identify shared values as opposed to these diverging values that seem to be driving us apart? And can we agree that radicalization in the direction of violence is a bridge too far for all of us?
Mm.
And I think, I was in a conversation with a scholar this week who's working on de-radicalization. And he says that in the Middle East, one of the most interesting recent developments is Christian churches that are becoming places in which former Islamist extremists are finding a path out of radicalization towards something more humane, something more whole.
Mm-hmm.
So can the Christian community be a place where de-radicalization can happen? Because I think what's going to happen is that some of our brothers and sisters who have moved to radicalization in this Trump era are going to need an exit ramp.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they're going to be disillusioned, or they're going to find that there are no real answers there, that they really kind of went around the bend, and they're going to need a place where they can exit. And we need to be a place where we can graciously welcome exiters.
Mm-hmm.
These are some things that come to mind, but the idea that shared American values, shared constitutional processes, shared legal structures are sufficient to keep us together in one community that is increasingly tenuous as we are currently seeing. It may be that the religious resources that are still present in our culture are going to need to be mobilized for us not to resort to arms any more than we already have.
Yeah. And I think that's an important charge for us to be listening into here, especially those of you in any kind of leadership roles. And we'll talk more about this next week. But might it be the moment that our primary role as church leaders, or one of them, is to actually create these spaces like David just described, where we are hearing one another, where we're identifying areas that we are moving in different ways in regards to our vision of reality and truth, and where are we identifying common values that can actually ground us? What might be a tangible way for us to participate in understanding towards restoration? What would it look like if in the next 6 months you as a leader didn't just get ready, spend 30 hours a week prepping for your next sermon or Bible study, but actually create ways, leverage your influence among your community to gather a community of 5 or 6, to sit with another community of 5 or 6, which may even be within your congregation, depending on how they voted, to understand one another? How might that contribute to undoing this uncivil war such that we don't lead to mass violence, as we just heard? Chaden, what if these questions are awesome. I hope you're hearing some of the threads of the answers to them and how we're interacting right now. We're not going to be able to go through each one by one, and some of them, like ones about social media and ways that's informing the way we talk to each other, I think is really important. I want to go to you, Chaden, about this, because I think this is right in your wheelhouse here. A lot of times we've had this exclusive relationship with our faith that we cannot talk with anyone outside of our tradition because it could like send us down a slippery slope. And so Jesus is the only way, and anyone that we can't, like, being open to another narrative is actually potentially going to threaten our faith, which we would say is not reflective of a strong faith, but a fragile one. How do we actually see our following Jesus as an added resource to sit with people from other traditions and learn from them, rather than as something that could, send us down the wrong trail?
Well, if we are to learn from Jesus and what he did, it comes to my mind his encounter with the Samaritan woman. It comes to my mind his dealing with Zakka. I don't know if I mentioned Zachariah. So we learned that Jesus broke this divide. Let me just reflect a little bit, because that story is close to my heart, his encounter with the Samaritan woman. We know the social differences, her being a Samaritan and him being from a Jewish background. So that was pretty, if we say today, bold from Jesus to actually go and sit with this woman and engage her in a conversation that ultimately led her and her community to know Christ. So if we are to follow the example of Jesus, we have to make that step, to be courageous enough to reach out for the other, to understand them, to respect them, to have empathy for them. So Jesus, throughout his ministry, offered us great examples of how to deal with the other. A great book that helped me open my arms, because as every Lebanese, I was scarred from the war, and I couldn't accept some religious communities that harmed me and my family precisely. But Miroslav Volf, in his book Exclusion and Embrace, helped me a lot how on the cross Jesus opened his arms to the other. And some of the dialogue rules that we have developed is to listen to what everyone is saying and speak positively rather than negatively about the other people, because they took some decisions that don't fit my own understanding. To be honest in what you say. Do not force people to agree with your views, as you said at the beginning, and don't judge people by their faith or what their community does.
Mhm.
and make every effort really to get along with everyone, regardless of their faith, gender, age, or race. Acknowledge the similarities and differences. That's very important because we have to live this. We have to live out our faith, not just be possessive of it. We have to actually live it by following the model of Jesus Christ.
Mm, that's beautiful. Thank you, Chaden. And thank you. I think it's important for all of us to hear the gift of Chaden and her perspective that this is very real. Like these conversations are real to us and our families, but someone like Chaden who's actually lived through a civil war and has layers of violence and trauma even connected to her experience of where this has escalated in her life. It's a gift when you offer that story to us. You don't owe that story to us, and so we receive it as a gift. And we thank you for the way you've modeled a courageous faith that moves in and through that. And so we're grateful for you. We dropped in a link to the book that she just mentioned by Miroslav Volf, Exclusion Embrace. I highly recommend it. David, I want to ask you a question because I've recently heard in our actually coursework, you talk about the moving target of truth in our current moment. That reality has become so subjective. One of the ways you described truth or defined it was just naming what is real, naming reality. And then when we can name a reality, that shapes the way that we live in that reality, which is character. So maybe truth isn't just a level of throwing out a bunch of propositions on bullet points, but it's a reflection of our character as it informs reality. At least that's how I heard what you were saying. How do we so a lot of the questions are here. Hey, I have family members that see reality as different. How do we navigate this moving target of truth or reality and find a way through it towards restoration?
I have not been the only one who has realized that that what we're dealing with here is a crisis of perception of reality. You know, in the second edition of Kingdom Ethics, in the methodology, that Kingdom Ethics is the book that Glenn Stassen and I wrote. Many have studied in seminary. At the core of the methodology is reality. You cannot function in the world morally or otherwise if you have a fractured or damaged understanding of reality. Reality, truth is correspondence with reality for most everyday purposes. A damaged understanding of reality makes functioning very difficult. I think that the most dangerous thing that Donald Trump has done, the most despicable really, is to damage people's connection with reality. For example, when it comes to the election, but some other ways too. Demagoguing, for example, I don't know. So when people get a really damaged understanding of reality, it is not easy to come back from that until the source of that damaged understanding of reality has been utterly discredited. And I think we're still in the process of that happening. To the questions, it is not always possible to have an effective conversation with somebody, especially if they have gone down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory and stuff. You know, there are people who believe that Joe Biden is not actually the president, but is operating on a movie set that is controlled by something. You know, I mean, there's not much you can do there, right? But it needs to be understood that that definitely not all of the 74 million people who voted for Trump have gone down the rabbit hole like that. We need to know who we are dealing with, and the only way to know that is to have conversations with people. But I would say this, especially maybe to some of our younger listeners, every moment is not always the moment to try to have this conversation with people in our lives. And especially if people in power over you, like teachers, pastors, or parents, are making you not feel safe, there are times when one needs to withdraw from combat or even effort to engage. But this also puts more responsibility on others who have more power to create safe spaces for conversation.
Yeah.
because these arguments can become actually abusive
Mhm.
and dangerous.
Mhm.
So so this is where leadership is genuinely required for people who have the ability to lead in these areas. I do think that we desperately need shared sources of information. And one thing I could contribute, I mean, I always recommend a balanced media diet of reasonably mainstream sources so
Mhm.
that people are dealing with something like reality.
Mm.
And people who mainly get their news from Facebook news feeds or whoever they're listening to, it's very susceptible to misinformation. We need to do better than that. And maybe church leaders can help direct people to, hey, here are the 10 news sources that I read to kind of keep me balanced and grounded in reality.
Yep, that's good. Thank you. And I'm looking at Austin's question in short as, hey, we live in this segmented, segregated society: left, right, conservative, Democrat, or liberal, educated, less educated. How do we even create those spaces? I think what David just mentioned is important. What's the role of leadership to actually create safe spaces? If there is a space that is unsafe, especially because of the power differential, we don't need to feel like we need to say the thing every single time. I think that's an important thing for us to take away from. And that may not even be moving towards restoration. It may not be true that the conspiracy theory uncle is ready to have that conversation. It might be more damaging to you than it is helpful to them. And so I think you have to use a lot of discernment. Who of us are in leadership where we can actually create those spaces to equalize some of the power differentials? Chaden, I know we're coming to the end of our time, and thank you all for the way you're engaging the Q&A and the chat. What would be, here you are, post-Civil War Lebanon, living as a peace builder, giving your life to this, studying it, practitioner, and here we are on the other side of the pond with all of this power and privilege, and we are fumbling our way through even having hard conversations with each other. What's your word of encouragement to us? Where do we, how do you send, like, what's your commissioning to us of sorts as we try to live into this call?
Live Christ. And Christ said we are his ambassadors. So we have to be courageous, take this first step, take the initiative. All of us became who we became because we followed Christ. So I want to encourage you, learn from our mistakes, because we did few of them, and prevent what could happen. And I always say, in the middle of chaos, there are always opportunities. So take lead, be courageous, and be creative. Be creative in finding opportunities and bringing communities together, engaging them in dialogue, loving one another, loving the other, even though they are different, they think differently, they took different decisions than we did. It's all about love. It's all about Jesus. So be ambassadors and be courageous, and let's do peace. Blessed are those peace builders. Yes.
I love it. Let's not just pray for peace. Let's do peace. And I think even your encouragement for us, as challenging as it might be, to see this as an opportunity. We often talk about, this is John Paul Lederach would say, that conflict isn't a problem to fix. It's an opportunity for transformation. How do we see this as an opportunity for our collective healing if we have tools to engage it well, which is what we've been talking about today. So thank you for that. David, what's your commissioning, your blessing over us as we go forward?
My hopeful word is that we now no longer take for granted the survival of a society in which we have a functioning democracy and people accept that their side may not always win, but we're going to stay together in community. Mm-hmm. And so we lose some American arrogance as we join the rest of the world in recognizing the vulnerability of all societies and all political systems. And that Christians in many such broken communities have done tremendously brave, creative peacemaking work. Mm-hmm. our Christian witness is not actually even dependent upon a well-functioning society. In fact, sometimes we do best in a badly functioning society because we sift out the extraneous stuff and we do what really matters the most. So, I mean, I want our society to hold together. I want our democratic norms to survive. But we are always followers of Jesus, whether in a dictatorship or a democracy, you know, whether in a civil war or utopia. We are still called to be followers of Jesus, and sometimes we get better at that when we are pressed into service to do something that really matters. So I kind of think that's where we are right now.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Hey, before you all jump off, there's a few things I want to mention to you that I think are going to answer even some of the ways you're saying, hey, where do we go from here? First, again, thank you, Chaden. Thank you, David, for your time, for your life, your witness, and then sharing it with us here. You can connect with Chaden and her work. The link is in chat. With David and his work, link in the chat. Support, read, listen, follow them in any way you can. And other mentors like them are going to be guides for us, signposts through this stuff. So don't take that for granted. Second, organizationally, there's two ways we'd love to accompany you. One is we understand that how difficult this moment is. If we can offer coaching or consulting on how to build those spaces, those safe spaces to work through this, reach out to us, and we'd love to support you in that way. The second is we have a workshop right now that we can do with your community on how to have hard and healing conversations. We actually see that as one of the ways that we can end this uncivil war, and we can do that with your wider community. You can reach out to us there, info@globalimmerse.org, to inquire about either one of those. Our second season of the Everyday Peacemaking podcast comes out on Monday. You can jump in on that and subscribe. It's everyday stories of everyday people living this stuff out, no different than you and I, and it's wonderful. It's infectious in its way. We actually can get a picture of what restoration looks like. And make sure to jump on next week for the part 2 of this around leading in this moment, leading that mends our divides, with Dr. Ephraim Smith and Dr. Mark Laberton and my colleague Jer Swigert. It'll be wonderful. So with that being said, we are grateful for you. We bless you and send you into this uncivil moment with a guide as followers of Jesus who actually calls us to move towards conflict, not with tools to win or to destroy, but to transform and to heal. And we trust that the Spirit is guiding us each step of the way. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.